Hi, everyone, and thanks for your patience and for joining us today. As you have noticed, we had a bit of a challenge this morning with the software, but I think we managed, and we're happy to see that so many of you joined us and were able to join us also in this new link. So this is the third and the last day already of this e-conference on Fall Armyworm in Asia. And we've learned, well, I at least have learned a lot over the last few days about what this outbreak means for Asia and what we can expect in the years to come, and also about what are some of the things that we can do. But what we didn't really discuss yet is what does this mean for farmers on farm. We talked a bit about what people can do, but not what are the realities, what are some of the things that farmers try, what are some of the impacts. So that is something that Fred Baudron will talk about today. And we also haven't talked about how can we reach farmers, how can we communicate and educate them. How does that work? What are effective strategies? And I think that's also a really important topic that we should talk about. So I'm happy that we have Sophie Poisot with us today to talk more, to tell us more about that. And as always, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can type them into the chat box. Helene is so kind to have been doing this for the last few days and to also do that today and to drag you from one link to the other. So just type in your questions throughout the session. You can also chat with each other if you have any replies to other questions that come in. And you can also use the online conference platform for that. So yeah, because we're running a bit late, let's just get started with our first presenter today, Fred Baudron. He's a systems agronomist at CIMMYT in Zimbabwe. And you probably know him already from some of his work that has come out. Really interesting research on Fall Armyworm. And there hasn't been a lot of research about this. So it's great that we have him here today. And yeah, over to you, Fred. I would love to hear what you have to say this time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Let me try now to start the presentation. Okay, so I need to share my screen first, right?
Yes, yes. So that is working.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, but we now see it in the, where you have the two slides. So when you also see the next slide, maybe you can change that to the big screen.
Like this?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
What's happening with this? Okay, thank you very much. So I'm gonna present you a few of the results of our research done by CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Zimbabwe, in Africa, and mainly as Linda said, in farmers' field. As you know, Fall Armyworm started invading the continent in January 2016 in Nigeria and basically colonized the entire sub-Saharan Africa and is now found since this month up to Japan. So perhaps we can learn something from what's happening in Africa. We can learn some of the control methods that in Africa, where also Fall Armyworm was an invasive pest, farmers have experimented with researchers on a number of technologies. The first immediate reaction of many governments when Fall Armyworm started to invade their country was really to invest in chemical pesticides. And I would say it remains also the main strategy of farmers right now to control Fall Armyworm, but with a lot of mixed results, not always very effective. And we know that methods based on agronomic management have a lot of potential. You can see on these small drawings from a paper that we've done with colleagues from ICRAF and other centers, a number of agronomic management from the literature that we know could control Fall Armyworm. But we have a lot of data coming from the Americas. We don't have a lot of data coming from the continent, from Africa. So there's really a lack of data, a lot of observations from the continent, but often anecdotal, not really tested scientifically. So I think there's need for more research, and that's why we started actually to do some of those analyses that I will present. And also the yield impact has been published as being very, very high. Like for example, in this paper from Kabi, like between 22 and 67%. But most of those were based on farmers' estimates, so really on farmers' perception of the yield damage, but not on rigorous field scouting methods and rigorous yield measurements. So basically, that's what prompted us to do this following study, and with those objectives to first estimate fall armyworm damage in smallholder field, not in experimental field, but really in smallholder field, with a rigorous scouting protocol. And then to understand what are the factors influencing fall armyworm damage, from different tillage methods, different fertilization methods, etc. All the different things that farmers are doing in their field, and then to quantify yield losses due to fall armyworm damage with a rigorous protocol. So what we did, that was basically a year and a half ago. We collected data about fall armyworm damage in 791 plots, each belonging to a different farm, in 2 districts, Chipinge and Makoni. So you can see in the small map, like the dots on the north part are basically Makoni, and the dot on the south part are basically Chipinge, a much more drier climate. And we followed the following protocols. So, I mean, if you know the methods like published by McGrath, for instance, in the USAID CIMMYT fall armyworm manual, using this W sampling, so 5 sampling points, and we basically scored a group of 10 plants in each sampling point. We used, as you can see on this small table, we used like 3 indicators. So the number of plants with leaf damage, the number of plants with frass in the whirl, and then a damage score from the Davis scale, as you can see depicted on the bottom. So a score that goes from 1 to 9, 1 being a very healthy plant and 9 being a plant totally damaged by fall armyworm. And then from a sample of these plots, so about 20%, we estimated yield quite precisely with a method of image recognition developed by some colleague of mine. So basically a protocol where you harvest some cobs from a couple of quadrats, and then you take a picture, and we have developed a software that can estimate very accurately the yield based on that. You can read more from Mackenza and colleagues 2018. So some results. So that's what we found basically for last year. So basically for the season 2017-2018, in terms of estimates of fall armyworm infestation. If we look at leaf damage, about 41% infestation in Chipinge and about 55 in Makoni. And if we look at the damage score, like quite similar between the 2 districts, around 3.8 basically in both districts. And now a little bit of a dance table. I apologize for that, but I will walk you through it. This is basically the result of the regression analysis that we've done to try to correlate the damage score to different parameters, different factors that we measured in the field. You can see on bold red, basically factors that increase infestation, and in bold green, factors that reduce infestation. So if we look step by step into those factors, first of all, we see that pesticide infestation tended to be higher in fields where farmers use pesticide. It's probably just a sign that, when infestation was high, farmers resorted to apply pesticide. It could also show that there is maybe poor efficacy from those pesticides, as you would expect, perhaps some level of control. Second, if we move, we see farmers who have intercropped pumpkin with their maize had a higher infestation. So pumpkin seems to be basically the wrong crop to intercrop with maize when it comes to fall armyworm control. But if you intercrop a pulse, so a legume, and as you know, this is part of the push-pull technology, you can see that there is actually lower infestation recorded across those 791 fields. We also found that frequent weeding tended to actually decrease damage, to decrease infestation. And it's probably because, in this agroecology, I mean, in Zimbabwe, most of the weeds that grow in a maize field are really gramineous weed. And we know that fall armyworm also consume a lot of gramineous species. Well, maize is a favorite, but also those weeds are probably consumed as well, and increasing perhaps the infestation. And we could see also that having a hedgerow, fields that had a hedgerow around on their borders, tended to have a lower infestation. It's probably, again, hosting some natural enemies and actually bringing some level of controls. Finally, something that we found quite interesting, a lot of farmers are using some form of conservation agriculture, either minimum tillage or zero tillage, and those farmers tended to have also lower infestation. And it's probably due to the fact that the retention of a mulch of decaying organic matter attracts saprotrophs and other herbivores, so alternative prey to predatory insects that then are able to control fall armyworm. Manure also tended to decrease infestation, probably through the same mechanism, decaying organic matter, alternative prey, more predatory insects controlling fall armyworm. Plant nutrition also seemed to be important. So farmers who applied a bit more phosphorus had lower infestation, but higher infestation when you applied more nitrogen. And we know there's a lot of literature on that, like an imbalanced crop nutrition generally increase the damage by phytophagous pests. So you really need a balanced crop nutrition, especially if you've got too much N compared to too much nitrogen compared to other nutrient. It's quite known from the literature that you can increase your damage by phytophagous pests. And finally, we found also an important factor due to the maize variety. So there's really a varietal differences there. So some varieties appear to be like more susceptible or more attacked by fall armyworm than others. So there is perhaps a way to select for a greater resistance, genetic resistance to fall armyworm. And that's what some of my colleagues are working on here at CIMMYT. Let's look at yield now. So if we estimate the yield in the two districts, we see not very high yield if you compare, of course, to some area in Asia, but for Africa, that was quite a good year. And for Zimbabwe, that was a good yield. So about 2 tons in average for Chipinge and about 3.4 tons in average for Makoni. But to understand actually how yield related to damage by fall armyworm, we used a structural equation model. So you can see here in the center grain yield. SCR is the score, the damage score. And we have a number of factors that basically influence both the grain yield and the damage. Need for nitrogen, for example. PPO for plant population. You can see like plant population was really the main factors explaining grain yield, but still quite well, a significant factor at least, and quite important one from the damage score to the grain yield. This is grain yield per plant here. So you see a factor of minus 1.7 for each point in the damage score in terms of grain yield per plant. So using this, and we use like structural equation modeling because of all these interactions between factors that can both influence the infestation by fall armyworm and the yield directly. So using this score of minus 1.7, we estimated, and that's our best estimate of the impact of fall armyworm infestation on yield losses. And we find a yield loss that was quite lower compared to actually previous estimates. For the two districts, that was about 11%, so far lower than the 22 to 67% published by Kabi in 2017. Quite higher in Chipinge than in Makoni, but we found basically lower yield infestation for this particular season. So this is all published in crop protection, so you can basically download it. This is freely available. Also, a number of websites, etc., a number of papers have popularized our finding. So this is all published. Now I want just to show you some of the results, some of the additional analysis we've done since the publication of this paper, basically 6 months ago. We wondered if the most vulnerable farmers were more affected by fall armyworm compared to farmers that would be having bigger farm or more resources. So we developed a typology. You can see like 3 types from this typology where we use like the age of the head of the household, the food self-sufficiency, the family size, etc. So we end up with like 3 farm types for Chipinge and for Makoni.
Sorry, Fred, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
In the bottom of your screen, there's this bar that says you're sharing your screen. Could you press hide? Just to
I'm
make sure that
sorry.
everyone can see the full presentation.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know this was appearing on the screen.
Yeah,
Okay.
not a problem. Thank you.
So if we look at these three types, we have basically type 1, type 2, type 3. You can see type 2 has far higher income and far bigger farm size than type 1 and type 3. So we could say that type 1 and type 3 are the vulnerable farmers, when type 2 are actually the larger farm with better income. But then when we compare, their damage score, and this is like, with a model correcting for a number of things, including like the district where they are, the varieties that they used, etc. You can see that type 2 farmers actually have far higher infestation, whether you look at leaf damage, fast in the world, or damage score, compared to type 1 and type 3. So basically, vulnerable farmers, the one with smaller farms and with lower income, in fact, have lower infestation, statistically significant, than larger farmers. And if we look, so this is a sort of a heat map. If we look at different practices from these farmers, you can see that type 1 and type 3 use far less pesticides and herbicides than type 2. So type 2 are, have much more intensive production systems. The intensification is much higher. But you can see when you look at hedgerow, the adoption of minimum tillage, so those numbers are the proportion of farmers adopting the particular technologies. So the proportion of farmers, in type 1 and type 3, so the vulnerable farmers, the smaller farms, adopting, having hedgerows around their field, adopting minimum tillage, intercropping or compost. And we know, like from the analysis I presented before, that those factors are important. We can see that basically a lot more of those farmers are using these practices. So in fact, more vulnerable farmers or the smaller farms are not more affected by fall armyworm than the bigger farms. It seems to be the other way around. So this is a sort of a new finding compared to the paper that we published 6 months ago. But we also wanted to add another year. So we repeated the assessment in the same field in 2018, 2019, the same field as 2017, 2018. And the infestation was much, much higher, basically this season, the season that just finished now, we just harvested, much, much higher. You can see in Chipping like 75% when you look at leaf damage. And for Makoni, about 50%, and also damage score much higher, above 5 for Chipping and around 3.6 for Makoni, so much higher. We did the same analysis, and we found a lot of things in common compared to last year. One more time, these are the same field. So we found higher infestation in fields receiving pesticides, probably the same reason as I explained before, maybe like farmers who find high infestation tending to apply pesticide and the other not. But also we can question the efficacy of this application. We found also a higher infestation, similarly to the previous year, with pumpkin intercropping. We found also lower infestation with zero tillage and with the application of organic amendments, which was similar to the previous year. And we found also that the balanced crop nutrition, similarly to last year, was quite important. So same effect of nitrogen and phosphorus. And we also found, similarly to the previous season, some varietal differences between the different varieties of maize basically used by these farmers. But we found also a number of differences. That particular year, no effect of basically intercropping legumes on fall armyworm infestation. No effect of frequent weeding, which actually was found the previous year. And we found a positive effect of having a hedgerow, a positive effect on plant damage, of having a hedgerow around the field. It was the opposite the previous year. So perhaps hedgerows can host natural enemies of fall armyworm, but also can host in some particular season fall armyworm itself and increase damage. And we didn't find an effect of planting date for the 2017-18 season, but for this particular season, we find a very statistically significant effect of planting date. And one more time, I have to say that this season was very different. It was a drought, so of course planting date was quite important. And we also found a negative effect of crop rotation on crop damage, which was not found in the previous season. We also estimated the impact of fall armyworm on crop yield, and we found a much higher yield loss in terms of proportion compared to the previous year, basically double of last year, around 22% for all the samples. So perhaps depending on the season, the damage by fall armyworm can change tremendously. And what we found also for this season compared to the previous one is that fall armyworm was damaging the silk of the young cobs in formation and basically affecting the grain formation, which was not the case in the previous year. So this pest, the behavior of this pest seems to change from one season to the next. And I really believe that there is need for more research. So still using this image recognition software I described before, we try to estimate how much grain we are missing. So the sort of a direct grain loss due to this consumption of the silk, basically no pollination for some of those grains, the consumption of the silk by fall armyworm. And we found that about 5% actually of all this grain loss was due to fall armyworm moving to the cob and attacking the young silk at the time of pollination and before grain formation. Another thing that is, I think, interesting and that I'd like to present quickly is the proximity to forest. So we really look more into detail of the position of the different fields in relation to what we can find in the surrounding landscape. And we run this kind of simplified model here where we included distance to forests, looking at forests of at least 0.5 hectares, patches of forest of at least 0.5 hectares. And we found a statistically significant effect. So basically, the closer you are to a small patch of forest, and the lower your infestation. And this is probably due to, one more time, natural enemies that are actually present in those forest patches, including perhaps birds, but also bats. With fall armyworm being a moth, it's quite important also to think about bats and consumption of those moths at night. So this is something that we're going to look a bit more in depth, but an interesting finding. And just in the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to present some empirical data that just came out basically this week of some work we've done on adapting the push-pull to the conditions of Zimbabwe. So I think most of you know the push-pull. So it's having a legume intercrop to repel fall armyworm and having some napier grass or bracharia surrounding your field to pull and to attract the fall armyworm. And this is the sort of data that we found. It's just 1 year data, but we found no effect of the bracharia surrounding the field. But we found that other legumes, not only Desmodium, as often used in push-pull, have an effect actually in controlling fall armyworm infestation. So I think that's interesting, and we need to adapt this push-pull technology using legumes that are available and desirable for farmers. Most of those are actually food legumes. So cowpea has an effect. Even groundnut seems to have an effect in actually controlling fall armyworm infestation. And one more time, we've put some traps and we have measured basically all the arthropods falling in those traps. We've looked at the population of predators. We've looked at the population of parasitoid. We've looked at the population of herbivore and saprotroph. And we tried to see through, one more time, structural equation modeling what was happening. And it seems like one of the main factors explaining the control of fall armyworm by having those legumes, or for that matter, conservation agriculture, which appears to have a big effect and which we tested also in this experiment. It seems it's basically attracting herbivore and saprotroph which are alternative prey to insect predators, controlling fall armyworm after that. So I think it's quite important, and there's a number of implications, including the fact that perhaps we should not spray pesticide on our legumes if we really want actually those alternative prey to be there and to attract predators to control fall armyworm. So basically, to conclude, I think what we've seen for the 1.5 years we've been working on fall armyworm in Zimbabwe at CIMMYT, we see that several agronomic methods appear to influence fall armyworm infestation in smallholder conditions. Legume intercropping, but not pumpkin. Pumpkin seems to be a bad idea to intercrop. Conservation agriculture, applying organic amendments, and also having some patches of forest around your field seems to be basically decreasing the damage by fall armyworm. And the mechanisms, as I was trying to explain, seems to be all those technologies are attracting alternative prey to natural enemies, which are then able to consume fall armyworm when it reaches the field. We also see that some maize variety appear to be more susceptible than others. So there's a big potential to basically select, to breed for maize varieties that are more resistant to fall armyworm. And this is a big line of work from CIMMYT. We also see that some factors, basically the effect of some factors appear to depend on the season. For example, early planting seems to be a good idea in some years and not in others. Frequent weeding seems to have an effect in some seasons and not in others. So there's a big seasonal effect, it seems, and also yield losses seem to be like affected by the season. Well, it seems, but it needs to be tested further. It seems like there's an interaction between like dry season, late planting, and higher damage and higher yield losses due to fall armyworm. We also found, which was quite interesting, that smaller farms, which also tend to be more diverse, having more diversity of crops, etc., tend to be less affected. But all this is only like produced after 1.5 years of research, and I think we need much more research to understand what's going on, in particular in farmers' condition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fred, for that. Very interesting, many interesting findings, and happy to see some of the new results that you just presented. Many things coming up, many things thinking about, but what really struck me is this type 2 farmer that actually has more damage in the field. That initially seemed a bit unexpected to me, but then when you explain that it mainly has to do with the type of practices being used, so pesticide, herbicides instead of all these other agronomic practices, it just supports your results and some of the things we've heard over the last few days. So very interesting. I was just thinking back on a previous time when you presented your work. I remember you saying that fall armyworm had less of an impact on drought. How do you see this in the continued study now?
In fact, the last time the presentation I made was based on this paper in crop protection that was published just 6 months ago, and indeed based on only one season. And in this particular season, indeed, we found that the yield losses in terms of percentage due to fall armyworm to be much lower than what was published before, like about 11%. But yeah, this season, as we have repeated it, we see that it is like basically double. We have about like 22% of yield losses due to fall armyworm, and this is really a drought actually this year. The previous season was like a sort of a dry spell. It was not a very good year, but this season that just ended now was really a very bad year. So in fact, we need more research, I believe. But it seems like in drier seasons, when people plant actually also later, it seems the damage due to fall armyworm is higher. And remember also that these pests are able to travel very long distances. I mean, 100 kilometers in one single night for a moth. Some moths have been recorded like traveling with the right wind condition, 1,600 kilometers. So they can come from very far. You can have like a maize patch somewhere. So if you plant late because of your poor season, you might attract also a lot of those moths coming from very far away. So I think we need also to really try to think of this population of fall armyworm as at a higher scale than farmers feel, even at a higher scale than a district or a regions, but probably like even a real regional scale where actually movement of fall armyworm can be quite important. If you plant late because your season is poor, you have a bad start, you might actually receive even more fall armyworm because you've got this young crop emerging when actually a lot of fall armyworm have been produced from other field planted earlier.
Yeah, there's so many more things we need to know. Like we have some insights now, but that usually raises only more questions. I have a few questions about the studies that you did. The first one is from Win, who is asking, could you tell a bit more about the types of pesticides that were used in the fields that you studied?
A lot of the pesticide, the most common pesticide used actually in Zimbabwe and in most of Africa is like lambda cyhalothrin and deltamethrin. So those are the sort of cheap pesticide used a lot also in the cotton industry. But of course, to be effective, you need to apply them when the larvae are really very young. It's not always the case. And there's a lot of issues, as we know, in terms of application of these pesticides. Fall armyworm, especially when it's quite young, tend to feed only at night and then to hide in the wall of the maize, during the day. So, well, it can come out during the day if, like, you've got a cloudy day or etc. But it would mean that if you want to apply your pesticide properly, you probably need to apply them in the evening or early morning or even at night when the fall armyworm is feeding. Otherwise, it's like hidden in your maize plant in the wall and under a lot of frost, and often it's not efficacious actually. So I mean, a lot of issues about those pesticides and how to really make them more effective. It's not always the right dilution. It's not always applied at the right time of the day, as I mentioned. A lot of issues, but yeah, lambda and delta are the main product generally used, also because they are cheap.
Yeah. We already heard that also from Paul Jepson yesterday, saying doesn't matter which ones are promoted, the ones that are more cheap and seem more cost effective are the ones that are being used most.
Very often, yes.
Yeah. So another question from Syed. He is asking, what type of natural enemies did you see in these fields?
A lot of ants. Ants is probably one of the number one, and a lot of assassin bug. We saw a lot of rove beetle as well in the plants, but not so much in the traps. I'd done some similar work with a colleague of mine, Judith Kebede, on stem borer in Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia it was also ant and rove beetles that were the major natural enemies. It seems here in Zimbabwe, assassin bugs and ants by far are really the main natural enemies. And actually, there's also another technology that we should perhaps test. Like some farmers have been applying some sugar solutions or applying some fish soup in their fields to attract ants. It's not something that has been tested scientifically, but perhaps it makes sense indeed to attract these major natural enemies. And we see by observation, you can even see some ants, pulling caterpillars out of the maize plant. Actually, you see they are very, very active. You can see also like rove beetle consuming eggs. I have a lot of videos of that. You can really see these natural enemies having an effect. But we need also to test like what farmers have been using to attract those natural enemies in their field, especially ants.
Yeah, cool. Because also on our platforms, people have been saying asking about using sugar dilutions, and fish soup also is one of them that came across. So there's many things that people are testing in their fields, but it's also time that we take it up to the science level and have a systematic approach to what works best and how it works.
Absolutely.
But still, it's great to see so many farmers experimenting and sharing the experiences already. That helps. But yeah, we need so much more research on this.
Yes, indeed.
Maybe just one final question that came in from Pierre, who is asking, well, this was all for Africa, of course. This is where Fall Armyworm arrived earlier. But for Asia, do you know whether people are already doing similar work over there?
Well, I know some of my colleagues are in the point of starting some work on this. I think Asia, of course, as in terms of the level of intensification, I think it's at a higher level than in Africa, and that's why I wanted to present this data about like different farm types. I think there is some implications. If like smaller farms that are less intensified but more diverse, have less fall armyworm infestation. Perhaps there's some lessons learned for Asia, where some of the systems are more intensely cultivated, perhaps more simplified also. So I think that's going to be interesting to see what are the differences, because we know that farming systems in Africa tends to be much more diverse in terms of heterogeneity, etc., than perhaps elsewhere. So it will be interesting to see the differences, but I don't think we have yet some data from Asia from my colleagues, but they are starting some work right now, actually.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think first priority for people was to establish whether it's actually Fall Armyworm that they spot in the country, and then to start setting up the research in that sense.
Absolutely.
One final question is: will you continue this work with these same farmers?
Perhaps not, but we will continue. Actually, we've done 2 seasons now, so we have learned a couple of things that now we want to test as hypotheses, like in really on-farm trials. For example, like the last slides I presented on the push-pull. So I think we might not repeat it with the same farmers, but we will continue like really assessing in other areas how fall armyworm impact is in the different seasons. Yes.
Yeah, great. Very interesting. Look forward to what comes
depending
out.
on funding, actually. So if we have funding to do it, for sure we will do it. But there's very little funding for research on fall armyworm, I have to say. A lot on training, not so much on research. So we need funding.
Yeah. Well, if there's anyone here with a big pot of gold, then we have some ideas here.
Indeed.
Linda, can I ask a question to Frederick?
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Frederick.
Hi.
It was very interesting to hear the data on yield in particular. And one thing that we need to keep emphasizing is that the damage from fall armyworm looks spectacular, but very often the impact on yield is not. And I think this is what you're showing variation across the years. But farmers see the leaves being devastated. It doesn't mean the cob will be ultimately impacted because of a variety of factors, like the maize plants' ability to compensate for the loss of foliage, right? And also the role of natural enemies and etc. So I was wondering if in your study you did try to model plant compensation. So based on the stage of when the attacks are taking place and the capacity of the plant to compensate this damage, how is this factored in? And actually the very limited yield losses ultimately is actually something that is has been observed in other places, and including in India. I think last year they were about 9%. So it's not this catastrophic yield loss ultimately, which is what farmers care about. And that's also puts into question how much do they pay for the control. So the cost that they spend on insecticides or other controls should not exceed what they might lose in terms of yield ultimately. So it's all these reasonings that need to be done to farmers. And I was curious to hear a little more about your model for the yield estimates.
Yes, it's an excellent point. Absolutely. So the model is it's really looking at the structures. It's a structural equation model. So we don't have a lot of points in time where we measured actually infestation to be able to look at compensation. But some of my colleagues are doing that, but on station with different varieties. But you're absolutely right. Like the capacity of some of those varieties to compensate is very high. And as you said, although you see like a lot of leaf damage, etc., you have very little impact on yield. And this is perhaps something we could select for, breed for actually varieties that are even better able than others to compensate. But what we found with this structural equation modeling is like all these different factors that affect yield, and very often, even this past season with this drought, even the previous one, which was a bit better, plant population is always the main factor that really explain yield in smallholder conditions. So in fact, like when you have a lower plant population, or because like there was a dry spell and some of those plants are dying and are not being replaced, this is a much bigger factor explaining yield in smallholder farms, actually in Zimbabwe and in most of sub-Saharan Africa, I believe, than fall armyworm damage. So it's true that actually you need to do the economics as a farmer to know, like, do I invest in those expensive pesticides or not based on this kind of low yield.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because what you're saying is, where do I invest as a farmer? Maybe what's going to be impacting my yield is not the fall armyworm. I don't need to invest in insecticides. I might need to invest in a little bit of time to replant and increase the density of my population rather than focusing and panicking on one pest. Really interesting.
Well, that's the point we made in the paper, in the crop protection paper. It was a bit controversial, it seems, but that's exactly the point we made. So thank you very much.
Great. So thanks for jumping in with a question already, Anne-Sophie. But now it's time. First, I want to thank you, Fred. We will try to come back at the end. A few additional questions have come in, but with an eye on the time, we'll save them for the end. But thanks for your presentation. Very insightful, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I would like to move on to Anne-Sophie officially. So Anne-Sophie Poisot, she works at FAO, and if I'm correct, you lead the work on outreach to farmers in the International Working Group on Fall Armyworm.
Correct.
Yeah, correct.
Exactly.
So you're exactly the right person to tell us more about this topic. And yeah, just go ahead, share your screen and tell us what you have to share. And I really look forward to this one because I think it's very important not only to talk about what are some of the things we can do and we can recommend to farmers, but also to really think about how can we reach the farmers and do these innovations make sense to them? Can they adopt them? Can they afford them? And yeah, how do you reach so many farmers in so many parts of the world? So very interesting. Yep.
Okay. So I'm trying to share my screen. Have I shared my screen yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. Doesn't seem to be working.
You are sharing your screen now, so that is
Okay.
working.
All right. How is that now?
Yeah, great. If you could just press the hide on that little text box. And then, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so it was really interesting to listen to Fred and to the presentations in the past few days about all the management methods that can be effective on the fall armyworm as we continue learning about the behavior and the biology and ecology of the pest. Now, one key question is how do we reach out to farmers and to extension workers and ensure that this information is disseminated as effectively as possible? And as we've heard, this is sometimes complex information and contradictory information even. So what do we reach out and how do we help farmers make sense of what they should be doing in their specific context? So for those who might not know, FAO and partners are coordinating under a sort of global framework, which was approved by a number of stakeholders. And under that, FAO and partners have set up 12 global technical working groups on the fall armyworm to review the different aspects from biological control to biopesticide to assessing yield losses, as Frederica just discussed, and all the other aspects, agroecology, etc. Right? To the right, you will see two bubbles which say communication and awareness and farmer field schools and extension. We have actually merged these two. And so I am the co-facilitator of this technical working group together with Cabby, Tamsin Davis from Cabby. And so what is the point of having these groups, this technical working group, but also others? It is essentially to coordinate activities. Many partners and at national level, but also government and research institutions are doing support and research and extension on fall armyworm. So in order to avoid inconsistencies and overlap and come up with more coordinated messages, this group helps people know who does what and sometimes come up with joint products. With partnerships, I will show some of these documents that were produced by several institutions working together so that we join forces. It's also helpful to have these working groups to share learning and reflection on what is working and what isn't for planning purposes. So in this working group on communication and farmer education, we have currently, as I said, co-facilitation by CABI and FAO, but also members coming from Farm Radio International, AGRA, some universities like Lancaster, CIMMYT, USAID, IITA, etc. So what have the members been doing in the past 2 years, sometimes together, sometimes also separately? Many fall armyworm outreach campaigns in Africa and now starting also in Asia. A lot of material, TV, video, radio programs, also SMS programs, plant clinics of CABI, farmer field schools to provide advice to extension workers and farmers. Collection of research findings into simple information materials. We've heard the complexity of systems and the understanding that is evolving on the fall armyworm from Frederick's presentation, but what do we know with reasonable certainty and that seems to be giving good results, especially for smallholders, that we need to distill into simple material that extension workers can use in simple terms and that farmers can understand. So we've also created access portals on Fall Armyworm and developed best practice. So some of this material would be available on for Asian countries who are now starting to have it, to tackle this infestation, and that can be adapted. Any material by, for instance, by FAO, and I think also by CABI, can be translated by stakeholders in their own languages without necessarily needing to reinvent and do new materials. Also, Asian countries, people who might be listening to us can join this group and to follow the activities and make new partnerships and learn what has worked elsewhere, which approach to extension and communication have been most effective, etc. So I want to show this because this is a sort of a synthesis of all the kinds of tools and communication channels and extension approaches that have been used with farmers on the Fall Armyworm. You go from the left to radio, TV, mobile phones, web pages, app, etc., all the way moving to the right to working on the ground with farmers and on direct one-on-one interaction or group interactions like plant clinic or farmer field schools. And on the left, for the radio, you see high numbers reached, but to the right, the experience is showing that the more you move towards personalized and on-field experience with farmers, the higher the adoption of best practices is, and the higher the impact of your message. As much as you have a farmer direct engagement, also your message can become more complex in terms of what works and what doesn't. Through a radio, you can maybe have very simple messages. You can't explain in person. And also it might be less locally appropriate than when you engage directly in working with farmers. So basically, this comes from theories of adult learning and non-formal education. It's said that we retain 20% of what we hear, but 40% of what we see and hear, and we take on and digest and own 80% of what we see, hear, and do, which is why practical approaches have proven to be extremely effective for adult learning. Because if you hear something, you might just forget. But if you see it as in a demonstration plot, you might remember what you've seen. But if you are involved in the actual management of a plot and into understanding and interacting in the field, then there's a much higher ownership of that knowledge. So communication approaches for sustainable Fall Armyworm management involve different stakeholders. We know that it's not just the farmers and extension workers, but also researchers, NGOs, regulators, policymakers, and also input suppliers who provide advice to farmers. And all stakeholders require access to appropriate information and through channels that are accessible to them. And this means that your communication products, of course, have to be quite different. If you talk about a researcher, they want to read Frederick's paper from crop protection. If you talk to a farmer, that's not the channel, of course. And if you talk to extension workers or policymakers, it will be something in between. So you need to have, of course, diversity of communication channels and communication products. So you have different types of communication, from research communication of research findings, publicity in the press with simple messages, but outreach also to support intermediaries and farmers in making decisions. And importantly, feedback, because you need feedback loop about how this information is utilized. Is it effective in getting the message? Is it misunderstood, for example? And learning also about local solutions and practices. So what we have to look at in communication, and this is very often misunderstood, is that it works best when it's not one way, of one source of information communicating to an audience which is not able to interact with that source of information. Communication is much more effective when it works always. It works both ways or multiple ways. So there is actually a lot of feedback loops, which you see in those arrows, where farmers, for instance, can ask their questions, or farmers can contribute their solutions. We were talking about earlier about the fish soup or spraying sugar on maize so that you attract the ants to climb up the maize and feed on the fall armyworm. So you need constant feedback loops and outreach. And as now we are moving into digital technologies and apps and phone-based advisories to farmers, it's really important we keep building back those interactive loops that farmers would have if they talk to an extension worker. There will be a one-on-one interaction. They can ask their questions. So rather than pushing messages to farmers that are somehow standardized and might not apply to their situation, or that farmers might not fully understand and therefore will ignore. So some of the systematization of information has come in this websites, the Fall Armyworm. If you Google FAO Fall Armyworm, you will find this website with a wealth of information, like this guidance notes or guideline on IPM, etc. Also on the CABI portal, that will be accessed by maybe policy researchers, policymakers, donors, etc. Then for outreach, you need also information that will be tailor-made to extension workers and farmers, and technical advice must be effective, affordable, locally available, sustainable over time. So many posters and flyers. I'm just showing here some examples that some of the partners under the technical working group have developed together with CABI, FAO, and USAID, for instance, in different languages. And that can be, we're very happy if this is translated further. So you have very good high definition photos for the identification and the proper recognition of the fall armyworm. So countries don't need to do this again. This has already been produced by various institutions, guides on community-based fall armyworm by CABI and FAO. So all of this, we're happy that people reach out to us and we can give authorization for them to use them and translate them and adapt them. And that's very, very welcome. So communication, as I was saying, these are examples from field outreach and mass communication approaches. Those that were at the left-hand side of this graphic that I showed early on. This is CABI's rallies and Fall Armyworm in Asia. FAO is also supporting countries in implementing mass communication campaigns and outreach and translation of these guides that I was just showing you into local languages. And they have to be very concise and very succinct, but very accurate technically. So simplification shouldn't also sometimes works against accuracy, and we try to avoid that as much as possible. And this is the skill in the communication professionals that you will need. So quite a number of projects by FAO are already on the ground in Asia. I'll share this example from Kenya's Ministry of Agriculture Info Service, run in partnership with Precision Agriculture. So it's an SMS to share knowledge about the fall armyworm. And what was critical in the scaling up is that the phone operator called Safaricom, basically their customers were invited to join the service for free. So there was this partnership with the phone operator. So they would allow the customers to join the service, and farmer just subscribe by testing one word, and they receive free fall armyworm advice. So the graph shows the evolution of the number of farmers who have joined, which is almost 500,000 farmers, 340,000 farmers, sorry, including also a lot of extension officers, and 7 million SMS received. And essentially, this shows who used the service and what did they think of it. And a lot, we could see that besides the user who used it themselves, they also shared information with their family, their relatives. So you can assume that there's a much wider dissemination of the messages beyond the participants. This was a survey that was done after the first campaigns were rolled out, to see who was using the tool. And this is what I was talking about these feedback loops, to see if your tool is effective, and get some qualitative feedback about whether the program was useful for farmers. As some of them you can see in these bubbles, some of the testimonials from farmers who are also asking more support on workshops and knowledge, etc. So creating these feedback mechanisms, so you can also hear from them what are the practices they've used or used last season, what has worked, etc. So it will not give you the precision of a scientifically conducted survey, and let's say with field trials, but it will give you a very, very broad coverage of thousands and thousands of farmers who are reporting on what has worked for them. You don't know in which conditions, but you get again a very, very large sample. So the messages I'd like to share is that we need a paradigm shift in extension, which we've witnessed in the past few decades, away from transfer of technologies to working and empowering farmers, moving from we have a technology and then and we know it's going to work, so we give it out to farmers who, if they are smart, will adopt, to a model in which you engage farmers thinking they have valuable ideas and they can be really strong contributors to co-creating solutions. And what you're doing is giving them a wider choice and empowering them in testing and making decisions. And the extension workers is no longer a teacher or a trainer who has the knowledge while farmers don't. Extension workers become facilitators also for farmers to share what they know, be valued for what they know, and can contribute and share with each other, which is very much sustainable because farmers stay in the same community. And if you create a platform where they can share with each other amongst themselves, even in the absence of that facilitator, because they have regular meetings and regular institutions in which they interact, then your advice will be ultimately more sustainable and farmers will have better ways of coping. This is what Farmer Field Schools, for instance, is all about. It was created by FAO in 1989 in Indonesia, and it's 30 years this year. And it's a group of farmers who meet once a week in their field on a plot that they put to the disposition of the whole group. And this is going to be a learning ground for them to test practices. So it would not be as rigorous as field trials conducted on research station, but it's farmer science, if you wish. And they're testing different methods that they want to try on fall armyworm management. So FFS were 19 countries in Africa. Now we are rolling it out to another 7 or 8 countries in Asia, with thousands of facilitators. And what you do is, for instance, what we call insect zoo, which is basically helping farmers observe the behavior of the pest, but also the behavior of the natural enemies. And so you're observing here on the photo ants, or you are observing micro wasps who are parasitizing the eggs, and understanding who eats whom. And therefore, farmer, if they observe by themselves those natural enemies in action, controlling the fall armyworm, there's a lot more chance that they'll understand the benefit of preserving them rather than spraying insecticides who might also kill these friends of the farmers. What we do also in Farmer Field Schools is we do defoliation study. We simulate voluntarily defoliation by the fall armyworm. So we remove some parts of the leaves to simulate the fall armyworm damage, to study the ability of maize to compensate for this damage. And ultimately, we were discussing this earlier, so the yield loss that they see from leaf cuttings is not going to be that significant. And it helps farmers understand that maybe the damage looks spectacular, but the yield might not be. So it's basically doing basic science with farmers. That works really well when you pair that with other mechanisms, like, for instance, farm radio. So in Uganda, for instance, we work, FAO and Farm Radio International work together to link a radio program with farmer field schools. So the farmers in the farmer field schools were able to explain what they were doing, and out of 5 farmer field schools, which is about 100 farmers, they were able to reach 500,000 people. So it's a 6-week radio program that was designed together with the field school, and listeners can call in, they can reach out to the farmers, ask questions to these farmers. So instead of talking to experts, they actually talking to fellow farmers in their local language, and that's highly effective. This has shown that it's improved the Fall Armyworm management, it had a wider outreach, and it's improved farmer enthusiasm and mobilization. So again, I leave with this. I'll leave you with this. As you in Asia, countries are designing their mass awareness campaign. This has to be kept in mind. We need media that's going to reach very vast numbers very quickly, such as radio, TV, etc. But we also need to pair that with approaches that are going to test things with farmers and empower farmers to make the sound decisions in their system, so that adoption and impact of the messages will increase. And if you do these things in combination with each other, that is highly successful. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to hear any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for that, Anne-Sophie. Maybe just go straight to the questions. Very interesting. So a lot of people are quite interested in this technical working group and whether it would be possible for other institutes or extension agencies to join in.
Absolutely. This is, to the contrary, very much welcome. And I'm happy if you, Linda, can serve as a conduit somehow to channel these requests to me. And I'm be more than happy for any other institution to join or individuals to join and contribute to the discussion.
Great. So for everyone here who would be interested in joining, just send me an email and I will forward that to you, Anne-Sophie. Great, perfect. Let's see what some of the other questions are. Well, maybe I'll just skip the queue and ask one of my own questions. When you talk about this paradigm shift that's needed in extension, I'm thinking at the same time, we in many countries face a challenge that there's way too many farmers per extension worker. So how can this work?
I think this is some of the things that I was discussing towards the end of having a mix of approaches. So having extension campaign or radio campaigns can work even better to reach large numbers more effectively if you pair that with something that's happening in the field in training farmers. So if you make that the protagonists or the characters in your radio program are farmers who are sharing their experience that who are engaged in a farmer field school, for instance, that will be even more effective than if you have a program that is just the presenter talking about and giving Fall Armyworm recommendations. He might not be extremely credible, or farmers might have doubts about whether they will apply these practices or not. But if they hear it from fellow farmers, we know from many decades of extension experience that this carries a lot of weight. So I think combining approaches can work really well. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that we need continuous involvement in education of farmers. Farmers are very often smallholders, have not studied for very many years. They have not borne on the cost of their country for the education system, if you wish. They have dropped out of school very quickly. And with the challenges of climate change, drought that we were discussing with Frederick, and highly unpredictable weather patterns, we need to be able to support farmers to make better decisions that will be relevant for them. So having these pilots on shifting the model, we need to continuously educate farmers to make their own decisions by themselves, because you're not, as you say, going to have an extension worker behind every farmer for the whole duration of their life. But if you take them through, for instance, a cycle of participatory farmer field schools for one season, which might cost about $25 or $20 per farmer, this is not that much, then they are empowered to, because they're testing things themselves, they are empowered to making experiments in the future and experimenting and testing by themselves. And once they've understood the mechanisms of the agro-ecosystem, like some of the dynamics that Frederick was talking about, it's much easier for them to replicate on their own.
Yeah, very interesting how all the, well, in this working group, how different institutions working together and also all these new ways of communicating and the new ways of working that we are discovering now, that there's so much more you can do than just the old school extension worker overburdened with so many farmers. So very, very interesting. Another question I had is, yeah, over the last few days, we've heard a lot about and talked a lot about pesticides and how it's not really the best option to respond to fall armyworm. But then in one of the figures you showed, you see that still quite a lot of people apply pesticides. So how difficult is it to break with that tradition, so to say?
I think more and more farmers are understanding that this is there are limitations and to the use of insecticides. This is what research now is showing also, and I think we need to accompany through research, like what we've heard today and in the past few days, a sort of change of paradigm about accompanying farmers to understand that agroecosystems are complex. They are a complex reality with many parameters. The plants are there, the pests are there, but also the natural enemies are there, and the weather is there, and the forest is there, we've heard before, and all of that, the landscape and the other companion crops, all of that interacts. So it's a gradual shift that is happening and that needs to continue to be pushed for farmers, but also for extension workers and for departments of agriculture to embrace that complexity, understand that complexity, and go much beyond there's a pest, therefore we need a spray. But there's a pest and it has many enemies that are natural enemies present there. And if the drought is there, it's going to be much more severe than if there's no drought. So maybe I need to work on moisture management. I need to make some mulching on the ground to make sure my plant is suffering less from moisture. Or maybe I need to invest in irrigation and not so much in insecticides. Or maybe, as Frederick was saying, I need to invest in plant densities and repopulating these densities, because this action will have a much better impact on my ultimate yield than using insecticide for one pest. So this is the kind of paradigm shift that we need to work on, moving from plant protection and of this concept of protecting a pest from a plant from an attack to integrated management of the pest and the production, looking at all the factors.
Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about the complexity of the systems and the realities of farmers, there's a whole world of challenges they also face. So is it in the future, because you have great structures now to reach out to farmers with all these messages coming out of the research institutions, are there also plans to have some integrated messaging? So not just focus on fall armyworm, but also other pests, and then extend it to some of the other challenges farmers face? Or is it really focused on fall armyworm and that's the best way to go because it has a more clear message?
That's a very good question. And definitely we have to keep thinking as a farmer when we are designing recommendations for farmers. And the farmer ultimately will have to look at all of these aspects in his system. And for instance, to farmer field schools, you establish a field throughout the season, which is a field where these 20 or 25 farmers will come every week. And you look at all the aspects. You look at fertility management, moisture management, you look at, how you run this crop. And you don't just look. Every week farmers observe their field and they look for fall armyworm, but they look for whatever else might be there. And it might be some stem borers, and it might be some beneficial insects, or it might be moisture is their big problem at that moment. Drought is a big issue. So indeed, we need to help farmers look at the system, understand their interrelations in the system. And the good news is that most of the practices that will be effective in controlling fall armyworm, especially for smallholders, will be good for the plant and the yield anyway. So some of the things that were shown in the previous presentation about using intercrops, moving towards no-till of conservation agriculture, having mulch, having a diversity in the crop, in the plant diversity, and also trees in the vicinity because of birds, because of bats who will control the fall armyworm. All of that are classical sustainable agriculture recommendations. So it was really interesting to hear that actually the farmers who were doing worse were the farmers who didn't have a diverse farm, who had some monoculture, were using a lot of insecticides and herbicides, and they were actually worst infected. And somehow that is backed by decades of science on sustainable agriculture. So indeed, we need to think systems. And that is true for fall armyworm, that is true in agriculture in general.
Yeah, yeah, great. I have one question here from Julian, who is asking about the vulnerability of donor funding. Like, everyone depends on donor funding, and great structures are being set up. A lot of things are being built. But how sustainable is that into the future? Is that a concern or not?
Definitely. I think most of the actors who are engaged in this, and in particular on this fall armyworm, are, and like FAO, I can speak for FAO at least, are trying to work as much as possible with the national institutions and the local institutions so that we don't train the farmers ourselves, but we train the trainers from government or NGOs or local institutions who will be there and stay to train the trainers. So we try to mainstream these messages and share these messages with the people who are there permanently, so that this becomes part of their approaches, and they get the right exposure to proper science, to lessons from elsewhere. So we see ourselves as a facilitator who convenes workshops. We've convened many international meetings for countries to share findings with each other, but that's also why we have these virtual technical working groups, so that it's not, again, one institution sharing knowledge with others, but it's creating platforms so that the people who are in the country, the ministries of environment and agriculture, the plant health authorities, the extension arms, and the researchers connect with others in a permanent basis and enlarge their networks, so that and their knowledge, so that they will be able to continue this after, as the audience has pointed, funding might dry because donor funding fluctuates, and right now everybody's concerned about the fall armyworm. In a few years it might be something else. Yeah. So this is really this mainstreaming and advice capacity that we are doing.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you're already setting up more sustainable structures. Sometimes you see that when donor funding dries up, when projects end, everything just kind of dies down, and it's such a waste. So it's so much better. Fred, maybe you want to join us again for a few last questions before we end this session. Because the first thing or maybe you still have some questions to Anne-Sophie, because she did the same to you. I'm not sure.
That was a very, very interesting presentation, and I think, very complementary to some of the stuff I talked about sustainable intensification. And indeed, having trees, intercropping, etc., is it's good sustainable agronomic management, and it's not surprising that it has an impact on fall armyworm management. No, very interesting. I think that with the pesticides, perhaps, I don't know, people who are listening to us, we need to be a bit careful also about pesticide. We are not possibly advocating to go away with pesticide. I think it will still be needed in some of the, especially when you have a massive outbreak of pests. I know some people might be a bit sensitive to some of the stuff we can say about pesticide, but indeed we have to acknowledge that pesticide can also do more harm than good by controlling the natural enemies. More than the pest itself, and there's also a lot of published literature that shows, by using pesticide, you can even increase your problem by killing the natural enemies more than the the pests. So I really like what you presented about the farmer field school, and for farmers to understand these interactions and to manage the system as really an integrated system. We also see I think some of the stuff I presented at the end about actually these mulch and legumes being important to control fall armyworm, like through actually attracting aphids and other alternative preys. I mean, it has a lot of implication also on how you manage your system, and for farmers to understand that, because like if you spray aphicides, you kill the aphids, you kill also the prey, the alternative prey to all these predators. You don't have natural enemies anymore in your field. It becomes like sterile in terms of natural enemies. And then fall armyworm have basically a field day when they come in. So yeah, it's very, very important, and I think it's a fantastic approach. And we need to learn more from farmers. I mean, I learn every day when I go in the field with farmers. They do some amazing stuff with fall armyworm management. So super interesting, really.
Great. Yeah, so when we are talking about farmers, I was wondering, do you see a change in mentality among farmers? Because I think the first reactions was a bit of panic, maybe. People are now more familiar, especially in Zimbabwe where you work. Do people fear fall armyworm? Are they just seeing it as one of many challenges they have?
Yeah, well, it's this season was very, very different from what we saw the previous one, and we published in this paper actually. So I would have probably wrote this paper differently now with what we learned this season. It was very different between what happened on the plateau and what happened, for example, in Chipinge in the lowland. In the lowland, it has been really a massive, massive problem actually. So after having published that, the yield losses are not that bad, you could see like the cumulative effect of drought and fall armyworm has been really devastating in the lowland this season. So yes, farmers really fear fall armyworm, at least in the lowland. On the plateau, this year, actually on the mid altitude, it has not been such a problem, and probably farmers are now, looking at it as, yet another, stress to their production, another factor to take into account. But on the lowland this year, it has been really devastating, and yeah, farmers are really fearing this pest. Especially that, it seems like the behavior was very different this season in the lowland compared to the last season. Last season, we didn't have like all these silks, being grazed and basically having a grain loss due to that. And this season, it was a big problem in the lowland. So yes, farmers are learning, are experimenting, but I cannot say that in the lowlands they have yet lived with it and stopped fearing it. Yeah.
Mm. What do you observe in India? Because I think it only arrived late last year in India.
Mid-year, yeah, about exactly a year ago was first detected. Well, as I was saying, for the last season, the yield loss officially reported by ministry is about 9%, 9 to 10%. So it's similar to what Frederick observed in his previous year. So again, we have to wonder what is the effective control that you need to put in place that will be cost effective if you're only going to lose 10% or even 20% of your maize ultimately based on the local prices. If farmers self-consume or if they sell at very low prices, the maximum they should be able to invest rationally, let's say on control, should not exceed that. And that might be very little, a few dollars per hectare. So, and even when Frederick, you were saying it's interesting to see the variation through the years. And I think that meets with previous research that's been done saying that when in drought, the maize plants, it gets hit harder by infestation because it's weaker. It's like a person who's sick. A person who's weak and not in good health and doesn't eat properly, doesn't sleep, might be more vulnerable to the first cold or flu that passes than a person who's really healthy, eats well, sleeps well. That's understandable. If a plant is stressed, it will be infested more and less able to compensate for this leaf of foliage by creating new leaves, etc. But it was interesting to hear you, Frederick, saying 20%. 22%. You say in the second year it's devastating, but if it's 22%, it's a significant yield loss, but it's not 80%, right?
Yeah,
it's not devastation. They are not losing their yield, their crop, right?
That's the mean. But if you look at the distribution, and I was showing like those density graphs, a lot of a lot of those crops were at zero, actually, no harvest at all. And of course, as you said, it's a cumulative effect of drought, the plants being sick and not sleeping well, etc. Plus the fall armyworm on top. So yes, I mean, it's hard to attribute, what comes from what. So from this structural equation modeling, we find 22% in average. So it's really looking at the average. We are looking just at patterns basically of the data, but a lot of field, like a fair proportion of the field had actually a zero yield. Yeah, but yeah, it's cumulative effect of drought plus fall armyworm. So it's very hard to disentangle the two.
Yeah,
and it's always important to highlight that it's a distribution. It's not that means that everyone has a 20% loss, but also that there's farmers who have graver losses and others who don't have that. Yeah, so we were talking a bit about research in the beginning and similar research being done in Asia. So what would you recommend researchers in Asia who are starting their research? What are some of the topics that they can dive into best? Can't do everything at the same time, so what could be a priority?
This is directed to me?
Yeah, I was looking at you. You can't see that. I was looking at you.
Yeah, there's many eyes. Well, I think that the first thing would be like to perhaps do an assessment in farmers' field as what we did like 2 years ago and repeated this year. I think like just to try to understand what's going on in farmers' field. So just go to a field, interview farmers about, what did they apply? Is there hedgerow around it? Have they intercropped? What was the previous crop? What's the sort of soil texture? I think just to do like a sort of as massive as possible survey, like a couple of hundred at least, and just like do some scoring at the same time and try to see if you can correlate anything. I think it's always important to learn what's going on in farmers' field to then direct your research question to, what kind of trials you need to do, etc. And of course, as Anne-Sophie mentioned, like talking to farmers and what they can see, what they have tried, etc. And basically base your research on those. But I think it's important to see what's happening in farmers' field and not start trials in control environments directly, which often are not very telling of what farmers are doing. I mean, I'm sitting here on our research station. It's every plot is very well fertilized, and we apply like 12 kilograms of fertilizer at basal. Farmers will have applied maybe 10 kilograms. You cannot compare. So it's really, I think it's very important to first see what's going on in farmers' conditions and base all your research on that.
Yeah. And if I may, the other way is true also, that sometimes what doesn't work in a station might work for farmers. Just this morning, I was having the visit of the Director General of the National Institute of Plant Health Management in India, and she was telling me that they tried push-pull on the research station, and it didn't really work really well, and they had a lot of infestation on that. And I asked, so what's around your field? Do you have a lot of maize in the area? And she said, not at all. We are the only maize field in the area. It's a small plot, and we have a millets research station somewhere else, and then it's many other things. And I said, well, it might be the reason, because you're the preferred host plant. You're the only ones to have maize in the field, and any fall armyworm who's in the vicinity is congregated to have your party on your plot. So, and there might be other reasons, and basically it was a kind of an organic management, and they let everything happen as they didn't do anything. They just planted these push-pull systems, so the various the intercrops and the trap crops and the repellent, and but then there was no real management. They were sort of wait and see what happens, which a farmer presumably wouldn't do. Also, he would try to save the crop, and he would try to control early infestation, or he would try some different local methods. He would crush the egg masses, or he would kill the larvae with some local insecticide. Or so it's interesting to, as you were saying earlier, Frederick, look at the landscape, what's around, not just look at the field, but have a broader scale, and be conscious of the biases they might be on a research plot compared to if they had tried push-pull in the middle of the with farmers in the middle of the maize area.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important what you're saying. We've worked for the past years on push-pull actually in Ethiopia, and we've published a couple of papers showing that in Ethiopia, like very often, like the landscape surrounding is much more important than anything you do in your field actually. And we promote a lot push-pull now to control not only stem borer but also fall armyworm. but it only works in this sort of intermediate complexity landscape. If you've got a very diversified landscape, even if you diversify a bit with your napier, with your brachiaria or your legumes, it's just a drop in the ocean and you don't have any impact. If you have a very, very simple landscape, like full of maize, and just in the middle, you've got your small plots where you put a bit of napier or legumes, similarly, it's not going to affect, this massive population that is being bred around your landscape. So it's really something that works for this sort of intermediary complexity landscape. And I think it's important also before we promote like push-pull at large scale. So I guess that's what the director of this institute also witnessed on her station.
Yeah, interesting. So I think for all the researchers from Asia that are in our audience today, here are a few ideas that you can work with in the years to come. We're almost at the end of our time here, so maybe just one final question, a bit of a difficult one, but what would be your main take-home message or action point for people who are listening in today?
This is again me.
Whoever of you wants to start,
okay.
But that's you now.
Okay, well, no, I think like really the main take-home message, I would say, would be to really look at what's happening in farmers' field and try to understand what are the factors that are really important in affecting fall armyworm damage. And then, as we both, I think, mentioned, and Sophie and I, try to think also beyond this link of damage and yield. Plants compensate a lot. It can be really very impressive when you look at it in the field, but in fact, in terms of the yield, it might not be that bad. And finally, yes, again, also some other things we both talked about, like this sort of interaction, looking at your farming system, your field as an agro-ecosystem, so it's a systems. So try to think of natural enemies and not only the pests, even like egg crushing. If you crush the egg, a lot of those eggs might have been parasited. And what are you crushing? Are you crushing a fall armyworm, or are you crushing a natural enemy that could actually erupt and actually help control your fall armyworm? I've got a colleague of mine, Shingi, who is very adamant about that. So same thing, like if you spray, your legumes to control aphids, are you really controlling aphids to save your cowpeas, for instance, or are you also killing a source of food for your natural enemies that will control your fall armyworm? So I think this integrated approach is very, very important, and to think about the natural enemies as much as the fall armyworm.
Great. These could have been my take-home messages. Yeah. No, I think I would start with the same one. Go to the field. Work with the farmers. Farmers know a lot, and ultimately they need to know even more. And they have a lot of intuitions. Farming, we have devalued tremendously the work of intuition in farming. Farmers connect different things. They know the weather, the birds are flying low, so it's going to rain, or it's not, or they know many things as systems thinkers that we had forgotten as researchers, becoming highly specialized. And somehow we have also learned and helped pushed farmers to de-learn this knowledge, and we have devalued it, this knowledge of systems and complexity. And farmers, there's a lot of things also they don't know about how these factors might interact. So my take-home message would also be farmers can learn this. And 30 years of farmer field schools have demonstrated that farmers can understand this if only we speak their language, meaning that we don't lecture, but we set up fields and we help them observe. We help them observe what's happening. This pest, this insect, what is it doing? Is it a pest? Is it eating? What is it eating? Is it eating the fall armyworm? Is it eating something else? And one of the experiments I did with farmers, I found, and that was in Ghana, I found fall armyworm and they were ants all over. And you didn't make the connection between one and the other. We took the fall armyworm from the maize plant and dropped it on the ground and observed that within 20 seconds, the fall armyworm had been attacked by a dozen of ants and dragged to their hole. And that was the end of the fall armyworm. And then he said, "Oh, then they eat the fall armyworm. Interesting. What can I do?" And I said, "What do ants attracted to?" "Oh, in my house, they go wherever I have jaggery, which is sugarcane. That's where they go." "Well, why don't we spray that?" and he found it. We didn't find it. And creating spaces like farmer field schools or other places, any interactions with farmers that's in the field to help them understand these mechanisms, that is something they will own for life. So it's why we call it farmer education and not extension. We're not extending anything. We are just giving a basic education in ecological literacy so that farmers will keep this knowledge for life. Once they know the concept of a natural enemy, they will keep observing this on any pest and on any crop that they have in their system. So you're going much beyond the fall arm, you're going much beyond the maize. So, and then the second thing I would say is also look at these local controls. If we have researchers here, I know it's not fancy to study, if sand in the world is working. But it's much more maybe fancy to work on germplasm or varietal development in the hierarchy of what we consider as science. But there is tremendous new knowledge that is there and that we still need to discover. If putting sand or creating mud with a bit of water and soil from your plant and putting that in a plastic bottle and putting that in the world on the fall armyworm, that works. And farmers have experimented that everywhere in Latin America and Africa. Why is that? What is in that? What is the mechanism? Is it suffocating? Is it drowning the fall armyworm? Or is there a cocktail of fungi and viruses and bacteria that's naturally present in the soil that's doing this? Could be really interesting research. And the landscape research that Frederic is talking about is also fascinating and highly complex. So I would engage researchers in Asia to work on that. There's a wonderful groundbreaking research that can be done and published, and that is much needed.
Great. Thanks for these take-home messages. Very clear, very important both. And also, I want to thank you both for your contributions today. I really enjoyed the presentations, and I think there's lots of things, lots of insights coming out of this and things people can learn. So thank you both. And also thank you to all the participants for joining us for these 3 days. This was the last day of the e-conference, unfortunately, but there will be more e-conferences that we will organize. So I will share a link later today with you. You can keep an eye on this website just to see what else we will be doing in the future. And you will also receive in this email the links to all the videos of these last few days and the slides of our presenters. So feel free to use that, to distribute that, to share it with other people. It's all there for you and for you to use. And also this online conference platform, it will remain online. So if you want to connect with others, just keep using it and we will keep posting there. So thank you everyone for joining us in these exciting 3 days, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.